If I asked you to name the single most perfect film in the MCU, a huge number of people would answer without hesitation: Avengers: Endgame. A movie that didn't simply wrap up a decade of interwoven storytelling, it made an entire generation feel something profound. Tony Stark's quiet but defiant "I am Iron Man." Captain America's long-awaited "Avengers Assemble." And that portal scene, the one where every theater on the planet practically shook with the sound of audiences cheering. Even now, years later, those moments deliver pure goosebumps. But what if I told you that Marvel's original version of Endgame was nothing like the Endgame we all know and love? Yes, there was a time when both Tony Stark and Captain America were meant to die together. And it doesn't stop there. Marvel actually explored a version in which none of the original 6 Avengers survived. Imagine that for a second. Tony gone. Steve gone. Thor, Natasha, Clint, Bruce, all of them fallen. And this isn't some wild fan theory. This was genuinely discussed inside Marvel Studios. Honestly, if that decision had ever been locked in, Endgame wouldn't be remembered as emotionally cathartic. It would have become an unnecessarily bleak and depressing film. But that's only the beginning, because in the original Endgame, Tony's death scene was completely different. Nick Fury was slated to die. Black Widow's sacrifice was even more brutal than what we saw. The time heist took a totally different shape. That legendary portal sequence almost didn't exist at all. And there was an entirely separate, insane magical battle between Doctor Strange and Thanos that we never got to witness. Today, we're not just revisiting a few deleted scenes. We're diving deep into how many times Marvel completely rewrote Endgame during development, and how every single one of those changes helped turn it into the most iconic superhero film in cinema history. So let's step into the writing room. Long before Infinity War ever hit theaters, Kevin Feige and the Marvel Studios team had a truly shocking idea for Endgame. The inspiration came from Toy Story 3. If you've seen it, you'll never forget that furnace scene, the toys holding hands, accepting their fate, and the audience believing everything was about to end. Marvel wanted to replicate that exact emotional impact. According to the original plan, all 6 original Avengers would sacrifice themselves together. Just imagine, characters we grew up with over 11 years, whose journeys we followed from Iron Man all the way to Infinity War, would all meet their end in a single movie. On paper, it sounded incredibly emotional. But when the Russo brothers heard this concept, they flat out rejected it. Their reasoning was sharp. If Tony, Steve, Thor, Bruce, Clint, and Natasha all died in one film, the audience would be too overwhelmed to emotionally process any of it. The shock would be so immense that no individual death would land with the weight it deserved. And truthfully, I completely agree with them. Infinity War had already left audiences emotionally shattered. If Endgame had simply doubled down into a grim catalog of deaths, the eventual victory would have felt hollow. The triumph wouldn't have hit the way it needed to. So the Russos made a crucial decision. Every character would receive a distinct, carefully tailored ending. Some would find sacrifice, some redemption, and some would finally get the life they'd always been denied. That single decision completely reshaped Captain America's destiny. Because, believe it or not, one version of the script had Steve Rogers dying right alongside Tony Stark. But then Marvel had a vital realization. What was Tony Stark's entire arc about? A selfish billionaire who slowly, painfully learned to give his life for others. For him, the only fitting conclusion was sacrifice. But Steve Rogers? He'd already mastered self-sacrifice from his very first film. He had spent his entire existence living for other people. He gave up his happiness, his love, his whole life, all for duty. So would a tragic death really serve his story? Marvel's answer was a firm no. Steve deserved the one thing he'd never allowed himself to have: a normal life with Peggy Carter. And when you watch Endgame's final moments today, you realize that Steve's quiet dance with Peggy is far more emotionally resonant than any heroic death could have been. For the very first time, Captain America chose himself, not the world. Tony Stark's ending, on the other hand, wasn't locked down until the very last possible second. And trust me, the version Marvel originally shot would never have given us the historic "I am Iron Man" moment that became cinema legend. That story is almost too poetic to believe. While Steve Rogers' peaceful ending was decided early, the biggest question loomed: how would Tony Stark's journey conclude? After all, if any one character stood at the center of the MCU, it was Iron Man. The man who launched this entire universe in 2008 needed an ending that people would carry with them for years. That's why Marvel wrote and explored numerous versions of his death. The version we ultimately saw in theaters was not the original. The first ending they shot contained zero iconic dialogue between Thanos and Tony. "No, I am inevitable. No, I am Iron Man." The scene played out like this. Thanos, brimming with confidence, slides on the gauntlet, utterly certain that the game is over. He snaps his fingers, and nothing happens. Slowly, he looks toward Tony, and Tony, without uttering a single word, raises his hand. The Infinity Stones slide into place, he snaps, and the deed is done. Visually, it was powerful. There was emotion there. But the Russo brothers sensed something was missing. The audience would cry, yes, but they wouldn't feel the profound satisfaction that 11 years of storytelling demanded. So the writers went back and rewatched Tony's entire journey. Iron Man 2, Avengers, Civil War, Infinity War. And it hit them. Tony's story wasn't simply about becoming a superhero. It was a slow, deliberate journey from ego to sacrifice. And how did that journey begin? The 2008 press conference. Everyone expected Tony to hide behind a cover story, but instead, he stood in front of the world and declared, "I am Iron Man." In that moment, a hero was born. So shouldn't his story end with those exact same words? That's when Marvel found Endgame's most iconic beat. Thanos says, "I am inevitable," and Tony, summoning the last of his strength, offers a faint, knowing smile and says, "And I am Iron Man." Snap. Black screen. And just like that, cinema history was written. But there's a deeply emotional detail that very few people know. When that original ending was shot, Robert Downey Jr. had already mentally said goodbye to Tony Stark. He had said his farewells to the crew. In his mind, Iron Man's journey was officially over. Then Kevin Feige and the Russo brothers called him and said, "Robert, we need you to shoot one more scene." Imagine being an actor who has lived inside a character for 11 years, already made your peace, and stepped away emotionally. And then being asked to put on the suit one last time, to say goodbye all over again. And here's the most beautiful coincidence. That final reshoot took place just minutes away from the very studio where Robert Downey Jr. had originally auditioned for Iron Man all those years earlier. The journey ended almost exactly where it began. You simply can't write a more poetic conclusion than that. And that's not all. Tony's final moments were originally far wordier. The writers had drafted numerous dying lines for him, different emotional variations, multiple sets of last words. But after listening to everything, Robert Downey Jr. offered a beautifully simple thought. Tony has talked enough in his own style. Let him be silent now. That's why, after the snap, Tony doesn't speak. Pepper takes his hand and gently says, "We're gonna be okay." Then silence. And that silence, in its own way, was louder and more powerful than any dialogue ever could have been. Marvel didn't stop there. One version of the film actually had Tony entering the Soul World after the snap, just like Thanos saw young Gamora in Infinity War. In that sequence, Tony would have met a future version of his daughter Morgan, an adult Morgan, who would have told him that his sacrifice was worth it. The scene was fully shot, but during editing, the Russo brothers removed it. Why? They understood that the audience would already be emotionally shattered by Tony's death. Adding another heavy emotional beat right on top of it would dilute the original impact. And honestly, that decision was absolutely right, because sometimes the moments we don't see carry the greatest weight. But Tony wasn't the only legendary character on the chopping block. Marvel also planned to permanently end another foundational figure in Endgame, the man who launched the Avengers initiative, the character without whom the MCU itself might never have existed. Nick Fury. And believe me, his original death was shockingly brutal. After fine-tuning Tony Stark's ending, Marvel's next major challenge was figuring out how to give the remaining characters a proper send-off. And it wasn't just Tony and Natasha who were originally marked for death. Nick Fury's demise was designed to be one of the most jaw-dropping moments in MCU history. Watching Nick Fury on screen today, he seems like the ultimate survivor, always one step ahead, always escaping by the skin of his teeth. But in early drafts of Endgame, Marvel decided that Fury's journey would end here, and it would be vicious. According to the original script, Thanos' Black Order ambushes Fury, and Corvus Glaive drives his blade through him from behind. Just like that, it's over. In many ways, this was designed to mirror Agent Coulson's death in 2012's Avengers. Just as Coulson's sacrifice united the team, Fury's death would have galvanized the heroes right before the final battle. But then Marvel paused and asked, does Nick Fury's character truly deserve an ending like that? And a practical factor also came into play. Captain Marvel was about to release, with Fury playing a huge role. If his death had already been set in stone during Endgame, the audience would know beforehand that his character had no future. So Marvel kept Fury alive. And that's not all. The post-credits scene at the end of Infinity War, where Fury sends the pager to Captain Marvel just before dissolving into dust, was almost deleted entirely. The Russo brothers felt that Infinity War's ending was so devastating that there should be no hopeful note afterwards. The audience, they argued, should leave the theater in stunned silence. But Kevin Feige insisted that people needed a tiny glimmer of hope. And because of that insistence, that tiny pager moment became one of the best post-credits scenes the MCU has ever produced. Now let's talk about the moment that literally shook every theater on the planet: Captain America lifting Mjolnir. Even today, if you ask fans to name Endgame's single greatest scene, probably 90% will point to this one. Avengers assemble, immediately followed by Cap wielding Thor's hammer. But here's the fascinating part: this moment was nearly completely different. For ages, Marvel's writers couldn't agree on one crucial detail. Was Steve Rogers always worthy, or did he only become worthy in that exact moment? Think back to Age of Ultron. All the Avengers attempt to lift Mjolnir, and Steve manages to nudge it ever so slightly. The look on Thor's face in that scene wasn't just surprise. According to the Russo brothers, Steve could have lifted the hammer even then, but he intentionally held back because he didn't want to embarrass his friend. That would mean Steve was worthy all along. He simply chose not to reveal it. But not everyone bought that interpretation. Others at Marvel believed Steve wasn't truly worthy until Endgame, because he was still carrying the secret of Bucky's role in Tony's parents' death. Only after making peace with that guilt, they argued, did he become fully worthy. Honestly, both readings are so compelling that Marvel never officially settled the debate. That's why fans still argue about it to this day. One thing, though, is absolutely undeniable: the way audiences erupted in the theater during that scene. Moments like that almost never happen in superhero cinema. And imagine if that sequence had been cut, or if the hammer had been handed to a different character. Endgame's impact would never have reached such legendary heights. Then comes Hawkeye's story. When Endgame opens, the very first emotional gut punch hits: Clint Barton enjoying a peaceful picnic with his family, only for them to turn to dust one by one. That scene is so powerful that, without a single punch being thrown, it immediately sets the tone for the entire film. But here's the twist: that scene was never originally part of Endgame at all. Marvel wanted to place it at the end of Infinity War. Picture it: Thanos snaps his fingers, and just before the credits roll, Clint's family disintegrates. Emotionally, it would have been devastating. But during editing, the Russo brothers realized that Infinity War's climax was already packed with grief. Spider-Man's death, Black Panther's death, Doctor Strange, Bucky, all happening at once. Adding Hawkeye's loss on top of that would have overloaded the audience. So they moved the scene to Endgame's opening. And that decision was brilliant, because in just 2 minutes, the film reminds us that Thanos didn't just break the Avengers. He destroyed millions of families. The biggest transformation, however, happened with Natasha's death. The former scene we watched today is one of the most emotionally devastating moments in the entire MCU. Natasha and Clint, both desperately trying to sacrifice themselves for the other. It's that exact conflict that makes the scene so heartbreaking. But the original version was wildly different, and honestly, a lot more action-driven. In the first draft, right as Natasha and Clint argue over who will jump, Thanos' forces descend on Vormir. Suddenly, an intimate emotional conversation morphs into a frantic action sequence. Clint fights to hold off the enemy while Natasha, without a word, makes a break for the cliff. Thanos' soldiers open fire on her, not once, but 3 times. Even riddled with bullets, Natasha doesn't stop. She drags herself to the edge, turns back to Clint with a silent farewell in her eyes, and throws herself over. On paper, it reads as highly cinematic. But the Russo brothers spotted a critical flaw. In that version, the focus shifts away from Natasha's choice and onto the chaos of battle. The audience would be watching bullets and explosions, not the profound bond between Natasha and Clint. So they stripped it all away. No army, no gunfire. Just 2 people, a cliff, the Soul Stone, and an impossible decision. Now we arrive at the part where Endgame becomes almost unrecognizable. Because the time heist we experienced, New York 2012, Hail Hydra, Captain America vs. Captain America, Tony and Howard Stark, none of this was in the original plan. Marvel had a completely different vision, and if that earlier version had been filmed, some of Endgame's most iconic scenes would simply not exist. If there's one concept that elevates Endgame beyond other superhero films, it's the time heist. Marvel didn't just use time travel as a plot device. They used it to lovingly celebrate their own history. New York 2012, Asgard 2013, Morag 2014. Every mission was a nostalgic gift to the fans. But the shocking truth is that the time heist didn't start out this way. In Marvel's early drafts, going into the past wasn't purely about retrieving Infinity Stones. The writers were actually planning to send the Avengers across different timelines and literally rewrite the entire MCU history. Not just revisiting the Battle of New York, but altering numerous other iconic films. Then a problem emerged. If every movie was revisited and replayed, Endgame would feel less like an emotional finale and more like a greatest hits compilation. So the Russo brothers set a firm rule. They would only revisit the past if it served an emotional purpose. And that single rule gave birth to two of the film's most legendary moments. Truth be told, the Infinity Stones were just a narrative excuse. The real reason to send Tony to 1970 was to give him a moment with Howard Stark. Tony had misunderstood his father his entire life, convinced that Howard cared only about his work. But when they meet in the past, Tony sees Howard not as a distant scientist, but as a nervous, excited father-to-be who simply wants the best for his child. And the beautiful irony? Howard is talking to his own son without even realizing it. That scene wasn't just a nostalgic cameo. It was Tony Stark's emotional closure. That's why, when Tony returns to the present, he's no longer the same man. He isn't just fighting to save the world anymore. He's fighting to complete his legacy. And then, there's the scene that made entire theaters burst out laughing. Steve Rogers versus Steve Rogers. Yet originally, this fight didn't exist at all. In the earliest drafts, Captain America simply grabs the Tesseract and walks away. No fight, no comedy, no. I can do this all day. Then the Russo brothers pitched a ridiculously simple idea. What if Steve has to fight himself? That one spark of inspiration created Endgame's most entertaining sequence. The absolute best moment comes when the present-day Steve, visibly irritated by his past self's earnestness, mutters, "Yeah, I know." Just one line, but packed with 10 years of character growth. The Steve of 2012 is an idealistic, perfect soldier. The Steve of 2023 is a little tired, a little more pragmatic, and just a bit sarcastic. That fight wasn't between two Captain Americas. It was a clash between two eras of the same man. And if there's one moment that genuinely shocked audiences into stunned silence, it was Hail Hydra! People in the theater literally gasped, convinced for a split second that Steve was joining Hydra. In reality, it was a sly callback to a controversial storyline from the comics. The fascinating part? That scene was added to the script extremely late. Originally, Steve was going to fight his way out of the elevator again, exactly like in Captain America, the Winter Soldier. Another brutal brawl in a confined space. But the Russo brothers knew the audience had already seen the fight. Repeating it would add nothing. So they replaced the entire action sequence with just two words. Hail Hydra! Fight over. The scene became instantaneously iconic, and fans received a callback that remains one of the smartest moments the MCU has ever delivered. Sometimes, a well-placed line of dialogue lingers far longer than a 10-minute action set piece. Because after the time heist, Marvel was tasked with shooting the single biggest action sequence in MCU history. And would you believe it? The final battle we experienced in theaters was radically different from early versions. In one draft, Doctor Strange and Thanos engaged in a full-scale mystical duel. In another, the portal scene was nowhere near as grand. And in yet another, the words, "Avengers Assemble," were never spoken at all. Honestly, if those changes hadn't been made, Endgame might never have delivered cinema's greatest climax. The evolution of that final battle is perhaps the single most fascinating story in Endgame's entire development. And that brings us to the MCU's most spine-tingling moment. On your left. Even now, those 3 words are enough to summon instant goosebumps. But originally, this sequence was far less emotional. In early versions, The resurrected heroes simply trickled onto the battlefield gradually. No massive reveal, no overwhelming payoff. During editing, though, the Russo brothers had a critical insight. The audience had waited not 5 years for these characters, but 11. This entrance could not be ordinary. So they turned Doctor Strange's portals into the emotional centerpiece of the entire battle. First Wakanda, then the Asgardians, the Ravagers, the Sorcerers, and finally Spider-Man, Black Panther, the Guardians, all pouring through at once. In that single, breathtaking moment, the theater transformed into a stadium. And I mean this sincerely, it wasn't just a hero entrance. It was Marvel Studios' 11 years of meticulous, passionate work striding onto that battlefield. Avengers assemble! Another fascinating detail. Even that line wasn't settled until the very end. For a long time, Marvel couldn't decide whether Steve should say it at all. In the comics, Avengers assemble is Captain America's signature battle cry. Fans have been aching to hear it for years. But if it was used in the wrong moment, all its power would evaporate. So the Russo brothers waited 11 years for one single line. And when Steve finally stands alone, broken shield in hand, with the entire Avengers army materializing behind him, he speaks it softly. Avengers! A 1-second pause and then, assemble. That's cinema history. Sometimes, a perfect payoff just requires patience. And that's precisely why Endgame's conclusion feels so complete. If Tony's original silent ending had remained, Iron Man might never have become the legend he is today. If Steve had died, his dance with Peggy would never have existed. If Natasha's sacrifice had been buried under an action sequence, the emotional devastation of Warmer would have been lost. If the time heist had been nothing but nostalgia, Tony and Howard's emotional reconciliation would never have happened. And if the portal sequence hadn't been elevated into a grand, overwhelming crescendo, we would never have witnessed that explosion of theater reactions that people still watch on YouTube on repeat. This is the difference between a good film and a truly legendary one. Legendary films aren't born on set. They're rewritten, re-edited, res-hot, and refined over and over until they become something timeless. So whenever someone tells me Endgame was perfect, I think of just one thing. Perfection doesn't emerge from a first draft. Marvel rejected countless ideas for this film, rewrote dozens of scenes, tested multiple endings, and finally delivered a version that wasn't just a superhero movie. It was a farewell to an entire generation. And maybe that's why, even after all these years, when Captain America's voice echoes through the speakers, Avengers assemble, or when Tony Stark's final words ring out, I am Iron Man, it isn't just the characters we see. It's our own childhoods flashing before our eyes. I honestly don't believe Marvel will ever again create a cinematic moment quite like Endgame. But one thing is absolutely certain. If that original version of Endgame had made it to the screen, we probably wouldn't even remember this film today as the MCU's greatest achievement. If you're as fascinated as I am by Marvel's behind-the-scenes secrets, canceled movies, hidden storylines, and deep comic connections, then make sure to subscribe to the channel. In the next video, we'll explore another incredible story that will forever change the way you see the MCU. I'll meet you there.